Grandfather, here's your broth. How are you feeling?
A mite stronger today, Sarah girl.
Grandfather, the mob is trying to come right into town.
May the Lord protect us.
The day, September the 13th, 1846. The place, Nauvoo, Illinois. For 3 days, more than 700 armed mobbers had been gathering outside the city, while within the city, a small group of 200 defenders had been preparing for an attack. Most of the Saints had left Nauvoo 7 months earlier.
Will the Williams load the gun?
Those who remained included the sick, the elderly, and those who were financially unprepared for the trek west. Their defense was aided by non-Mormon residents who now owned homes vacated when the Saints began their first exodus 7 months earlier. Together, they withstood one major attack of the mobbers and 2 more days of sporadic firing. The Battle of Nauvoo ended when both sides agreed to a treaty in which the remaining Mormons would leave the state immediately. The treaty was to be signed on September the 17th. The Saints, fearful that its protective terms would not be honored by their enemies, worked through the night of the 16th to evacuate the city. Taking whatever they could carry in their hands, the sick in their beds, with little transportation, without enough tents, without food. Because of their desperate circumstances, they became known as the Poor Saints. They camped on the west bank of the Mississippi, and according to the diary of Jane Johnston Black, in one night, 9 babies were added to the population of about 700 men, women, and children who waited for help, for relief from their suffering. Human help, in the form of wagons sent from the Saints' main camps further west, took time. But divine help came more quickly, as the modern-day children of Israel witnessed a miracle. Flocks of quail alighted in the camp and provided meat for the Saints till human help arrived and they could continue their exodus. And where were they headed? Why, to join other Saints and their prophet, Brigham Young, in a latter-day camp of Israel, at Winter Quarters, Nebraska, there to prepare for the journey west. Winter Quarters lay on the west bank of the Missouri River, across the river and about 12 miles northwest of Council Bluffs, the second largest of several temporary settlements of the Saints. Over 1,500 Saints, with 30,000 head of cattle, had fled from Nauvoo across the state of Iowa to settle near the Missouri River. The Saints left Nauvoo in early spring 1846, with hopes of getting to the Salt Lake Valley. But they decided they would go only to the Missouri River and prepare more for the upcoming trip. Winter Quarters was planned to serve the Saints as a place to winter and prepare for the trek west to the Great Basin. As Brigham Young explained it,
"While some will have the means to go forward at the springing of the grass, others will have to stop and raise grain and prepare for the journey. In either case, all preparation and organization is for journeying and not for permanent location in winter quarters."
When the poor Saints arrived in Winter Quarters late in 1846, they found a bustle of activity. The work was divided among the men of the camp, and a temporary city was being built to shelter the refugees during the approaching winter. Soon houses began replacing tents. Most of them were constructed of logs and clapboard, dirt-covered willows laid across poles, or simple dugouts, holes dug in the hillside and covered with willows and dirt. An uncommonly favorable winter with no snow until the first part of January proved a blessing to the Saints who were struggling to build shelters. Hosea Stout tells of his moving day.
Today I was employed in moving into my little house, now partly furnished, it being 12 feet square on the outside. Tonight, myself and the family had the pleasure of once more sleeping in our own house for the first time in more than 9 months.
On October the 15th, Eliza Lyman wrote of her little house.
We have taken possession of our log house today, the first house my babe was ever in. I feel extremely thankful for the privilege of sitting by a fire where the wind cannot blow it in every direction and where I can warm one side without freezing the other. Our house is minus floor and many other comforts, but the walls protect us from the wind, if the sod roof does not from the rain.
By the time 1847 dawned, over 700 dwellings crowded the landscape at winter quarters. A large stockade enclosed homes, a meeting house, workshops, a grist mill, and a blockhouse in case of attack by an Indian war party. To protect the herds in the city, a police force was organized and a property tax of 0.75% was levied to pay the force.
Brother Stephen has a matter of business he'd like to put before the council.
High councils governed in both religious and secular matters. Winter quarters eventually had 22 wards under the direction of the council. 5 other encampments were soon large enough to need high councils also. By the end of January 1847, the snow began to blow. And in February, Brother Stout records,
This morning, the snow had blown and drifted until it was near halfway to the top of my door, and I could scarcely get it open.
the prairie winter was a harsh one. The earth did not yield up food, and the open prairie offered little shelter from the unrelenting wind and cold. Food was scarce, and sickness was widespread. Horseradish growing at a nearby abandoned government fort and potatoes brought in from northern Missouri helped to allay the scurvy that was prevalent in the camp. But many problems remained. The river itself contributed to the sickness. It collected sewage from tributary streams, and because of the effects of this pollution, the Saints nicknamed the Missouri bottoms Misery Bottoms. Even more intimate glimpses of their hardships, and yes, their triumphs too, come from diaries and journals kept by the Saints and their visitors. Colonel Thomas L. Kane was one of these visitors. A politically influential non-member, he often helped the Saints in time of need. He visited winter quarters early that fall and described the effects of widespread fevers.
They let their cows go unmilked. They wanted for voices to raise the psalm on Sundays. Here at one time, the digging of graves got behindhand. Burials were slow, and you might see women sit in the open tents, keeping the flies off their dead children.
600 Saints in the winter quarters area died during that trying winter. John R. Young, who was a boy during those months, calls winter quarters the Valley Forge of Mormondom. He later wrote,
Our home was near the burying ground, and I can remember the small, mournful-looking trains that so often passed our door. I also remember how poor and same-like our habitual diet was. Cornbread, salt bacon, and a little milk. Mush and bacon became so nauseating that it was like taking medicine to swallow it. And the scurvy was making such inroads amongst us that it looked as if we should all be sleeping on the hill before spring, unless fresh food could be obtained. While we were in this condition, there happened one of those singular events which so often flit across the life of a Mormon. President Young called one day at the door of our cabin and said to my father,
Lorenza, if you will hitch up your horses and go down into Missouri, the Lord will open the way so that you can bring up a drove of hogs and give the people fresh meat.
Well, the next day, Father took me in the wagon and started on that mission. Father returned to winter quarters with 1,000 head of hogs, and President Young's promise to him had been realized.
to get food for the winter and wagons and provisions for the trip west, many Saints traveled to settlements in Iowa and Missouri and worked or sold nearly all they had: watches, feather beds, horses, furniture. It was not only the saints who suffered through the long winter. Two tribes of Indians, the Otos and the Omahas, had given the white travelers permission to stay on their land. The two tribes quarreled between themselves, but got along peaceably with the saints. The Omahas were extremely poor, however, and that winter were almost forced to live by gift or by theft. The saints tried to discourage those Indians who would live by theft, yet they shared with those who were forced to live by gift.
It's cheaper to feed the Indians than to fight them,
advised Brigham Young. And when the more warlike Iowa Indians attacked an Omaha Indian camp near Winter Quarters, President Young let the Omahas move their lodges near his home and had the wounded placed in a nearby sod hut. The saints were not generally the hearty frontier type we often imagine. In their New England homes, they had been used to refinement and to the conveniences of the day. What cause but the Lord's could convince them to leave behind such physical comforts for the hardships and uncertainties before them? It was their faith that sustained them. There were a few saints who became weak in the faith. By December, a few were complaining, refusing to pay tithing and taxes, unwilling to help the poor, and refusing to follow the requirements of the High Council. Deciding that the gospel was not worth the price, they turned back. But the majority of saints passed through that trying winter without becoming bitter or hardened in spirit. They loved the Lord and were convinced they were following a prophet. No matter how dreary their circumstances, still they maintained a joy of living. Sparkling merriment, intellectual playfulness, the lively strains of the violin were yet a part of the pioneer life. There were also family gatherings, birthday and wedding day anniversaries, music and song, cheering the hearts of men in those wilderness encampments of the Latter-day Saints. Above all, they maintained their faith. Colonel Thomas L. Kane observed,
Every day closed as every day began. With the first shining of the stars, laughter and loud talk hushed. The neighbor went his way. You heard the last hymn sung, and then the thousand-voiced murmur of prayer was heard, like babbling water falling down the hills.
With the coming of spring, the preparations that had been underway all winter intensified. Wagon making, farm tool and seed buying, food gathering, all pointed toward the coming journey. In April of 1847, the advance company set out, led by Brigham Young. Their assignment, to begin building and planting upon arrival at their destination to prepare for the groups to follow. The westward trek had begun. That summer and the following spring, company after company of saints left for the west. And by the following May of 1848, those remaining in winter quarters moved eastward across the river to Council Bluffs to complete their preparations for the westward journey. Winter Quarters, now emptied of its inhabitants, had fulfilled its purpose. And the saints looked to the west for their refuge, their hoped-for land of promise. Hence, without food. Because of their desperate circumstances, they became known as the poor saints. They camped on the west bank of the Mississippi, and according to the diary of Jane Johnston Black, in one night, 9 babies were added to the population of about 700 men, women, and children who waited for help, for relief from their suffering. 46. The place, Nauvoo, Illinois. For 3 days, more than 700 armed mobbers had been gathering outside the city, while within the city, a small group of 200 defenders had been preparing for an attack. Most of the Saints had left Nauvoo 7 months earlier.
Will the Williams roll the gun?
Those who remained included the sick, the elderly. Both sides agreed to a treaty in which the remaining Mormons would leave the state immediately. The treaty was to be signed on September the 17th. The Saints, fearful that its protective terms would not be honored by their enemies, worked through the night of the 16th to evacuate the city. Taking whatever they could carry in their hands, the sick in their beds, with little transportation, without enough and those who were financially unprepared for the trek west. Their defense was aided by non-Mormon residents who now owned homes vacated when the Saints began their first exodus 7 months earlier. Together, they withstood one major attack of the mobbers and 2 more days of sporadic firing. The Battle of Nauvoo ended when both...
Grandfather, here's your broth. How are you feeling?
A mite stronger today, Sarah girl.
Grandfather, the mob is trying to come right into town.
May the Lord protect us.
The day, September the 13th, 1840.